The waters of the Taiwan Strait were calm on the surface, but anyone watching closely knew it was an illusion. Cargo ships sailed, fishing boats drifted, tourists snapped photos on distant shores. But above the calm, radar screens hummed and sonar arrays pinged. Chinese warships kept to their lanes, Taiwan's patrols stayed alert, and American satellites hovered quietly overhead. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind of silence where every player knew the first noise could start a war. Beijing didn't announce a new offensive. There were no dramatic speeches. Instead, it was the absence of sound that became the message. Naval maneuvers that once roared with propaganda were muted. Cyber intrusions that might have been flaunted were cloaked in deniability. The Chinese Communist Party wanted quiet, because in that quiet, Xi Jinping was playing the most dangerous game of all, trying to move without Donald Trump noticing. This is 2025, and the stage is set in ways that feel both familiar and foreign. The United States, under President Donald Trump's second term, projects an image of raw confidence. Trump himself has warned repeatedly that China is not just a competitor, but a shadow opponent probing for weaknesses. In his words earlier this year, China doesn't want to fight you face to face. They want to sneak around you. They want you to think it's all calm, until it's not. His critics dismissed it as bluster, but in the silence over Taiwan, some began to wonder if Trump's instincts were, once again, sharper than his rhetoric suggested. For Xi Jinping, the Taiwan question is not a debate, it's destiny. In speech after speech, he frames reunification as inevitable, a historic mission. But how to reach that goal is another matter. The old idea of tanks rolling onto beaches risks a catastrophic war with the United States and NATO allies in Asia. Instead, Beijing's doctrine has evolved. Not a loud invasion, but a suffocating squeeze. She doesn't need to storm Taipei in a single night. He just needs to make Taiwan isolated, unrecognizable as a sovereign entity, and too fragile to resist when the final step comes. And so, silence becomes strategy. A blockade that isn't called a blockade. Flights diverted by safety advisories. Data cables cut by accidents. Each move small enough to deny aggression, large enough to strain Taiwan's confidence. It's the art of ambiguity, and it's happening now. While Trump's attention is pulled in 100 other directions, from Russia's space tests to the Middle East's constant flare-ups, Xi is betting that if he moves carefully, the world won't call his bluff until it's too late. The warning signs, however, are mounting. American intelligence has picked up irregular patterns in Chinese naval deployments. Vessels lingering longer in choke points, submarines shadowing merchant ships. Satellite photos reveal construction of new radar outposts on islets near Taiwan's shipping lanes. And cyber analysts whisper about intrusions into Taiwanese infrastructure. Power grids flickering, banks reporting odd disruptions, flight control systems briefly glitching. None of it definitive, all of it deniable. But taken together, it sketches the outline of a campaign already in motion. Inside Taipei, the mood is strained. Taiwanese leaders speak cautiously, aware that raising alarms could spook markets and so panic. Yet privately, they acknowledge the fear that Xi Jinping has chosen 2025 not for an invasion, but for an unannounced strangulation. President Tsai Ing-wen warns allies behind closed doors. We may not see the tanks, but the pressure is here. And if it continues, the day will come when Taiwan cannot breathe. Trump, meanwhile, treats Taiwan as both a geopolitical challenge and a personal test. His administration has accelerated arms sales, pushed joint exercises with Japan, and ordered U.S. warships to sail through the strait as freedom of navigation patrols. At rallies, he frames it bluntly. We're not going to let Xi take Taiwan while I'm president. It's not happening. If he tries, it's going to be the biggest mistake of his life. Supporters cheer. Critics worry that the line between deterrence and provocation is razor thin. But Trump's instinct has always been to speak louder than his adversaries. Xi's instinct, in contrast, is to move quieter than his enemies expect. That contrast sets the stage for this silent standoff. Beijing is betting that subtlety will paralyze Washington, while Washington is betting that Trump's voice alone can stop Xi from stepping further. In between those bets lies Taiwan's fate. The silence isn't just on the seas. It's in the airwaves. Taiwanese pilots report unusual jamming near their aircraft, brief blackouts in communication frequencies. Civilian airlines crossing the region quietly adjust flight paths to avoid unreliable signals. In Europe, insurance companies quietly raise premiums on ships headed to Taiwan's ports. Markets feel the tremors even if no missiles fly. And every tremor feeds Beijing's narrative that Taiwan is unstable, unsafe, uncertain. For ordinary citizens, the signals are subtle but unsettling. Grocery prices rise as shipping slows. ATMs glitch for a few hours, blamed on technical issues. News anchors mention more Chinese Coast Guard ships accidentally drifting into Taiwanese waters. None of it screams war, but all of it whispers pressure. And the whispers are what she wants, small enough to ignore, big enough to accumulate. The goal is not shock, but erosion. Not conquest, but exhaustion. Inside the Trump administration, advisors are split. Hawks argue that silence itself is a weapon, and that America must counter with louder, bolder shows of strength, deploy more ships, send more weapons, broadcast more threats. Others caution that this is exactly what Beijing wants, a provoked America that looks like the aggressor. Trump listens, but in public, he stays firm. China's playing games. They don't want you to see it, but I see it. Believe me, I see it better than anyone. Whether he truly does, or whether she is already several moves ahead, is the question haunting Washington. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping's state media paints a calm picture. Broadcasts emphasize harmony, prosperity, the inevitability of peaceful reunification. Analysts on Chinese television dismiss Western alarm as paranoia. The West invents threats because it cannot accept China's rise. One commentator says, "The message is clear. Nothing unusual is happening," which is precisely why the unusual feels so threatening. For NATO, the silence is disorienting. The alliance was built to respond to clear aggression, to tanks rolling into Europe, to missiles crossing borders. But how do you respond to satellites jammed, to trade routes quietly squeezed, to citizens spooked by whispers? The rules of engagement weren't written for silence. And so, the silence itself becomes a shield for Beijing, its actions hidden not by secrecy, but by ambiguity. The silence stretches further into cyberspace. American analysts track increased Chinese activity around undersea internet cables, the veins of global connectivity. A cable that links Taiwan to Japan goes offline for 12 hours. Officially, it's maintenance. Unofficially, it's a test of how long Taiwan can operate when cut from the outside world. These incidents don't make headlines, but they send shivers through intelligence circles. They know what she knows. A nation doesn't have to be invaded, to be strangled. It just has to be cut, line by line, until the silence swallows everything. By the time the world notices, it may be too late. And that is the gamble Xi Jinping is playing. Silence is strategy. Ambiguity is weapon. Deniability is shield. He doesn't want Trump to notice. Not yet. Because once Trump notices, once Trump decides to make noise, the game shifts. And she is betting he can advance further in silence than Trump can shout from the podium. So here we are, in the spring of 2025. Taiwan's skies are calm, but its nerves are frayed. China's ships sail in silence, but their shadows grow heavier. America's president raises his voice, but his words must cut through the quiet she has woven. It is a standoff defined not by explosions, but by silence. And silence, history warns, can be the loudest signal of all. The silence deepened, and with it came unease. In Washington, Trump's national security team met daily, sometimes twice a day. In the Situation Room, maps of the Taiwan Strait glowed on the screens, dotted with Chinese vessels and American patrol routes. Reports piled high. Glitches in undersea cables, strange patterns of radar interference, merchant ships harassed by Chinese coast guards. None of it crossed the threshold of open war. All of it whispered of one building. Xi Jinping's pressure campaign was working, because every signal was just shy of undeniable. And Donald Trump knew that the hardest war to fight was the one that hadn't officially started. Trump was never one to mince words. "She's trying to be sneaky," he said during a press conference at the White House. But the truth is, we see him. We know what he's doing. He wants Taiwan without a war. He wants it quietly. But you don't get Taiwan quietly with me around. His bluntness drew cheers from supporters, but behind the scenes, his team was less certain. How do you deter moves that don't look like moves? How do you push back against silence? Inside Beijing, Xi Jinping calculated carefully. The Russian satellite strike had already shown the world that modern power isn't about loud invasions, but about cutting off the unseen lifelines. She had studied that lesson. Instead of announcing a blockade, Chinese ships inspected foreign vessels bound for Taiwan. Instead of seizing territory, they built more maritime safety zones. And instead of rolling tanks across beaches, they turned up the dial on cyber interference, probing Taiwan's electric grids and airports. Each move was like tightening a rope, not enough to choke, but enough for everyone to feel it. The message to Taiwan was clear. You are surrounded. You are vulnerable, and the world may not come to save you. But she wanted something more, to test whether Trump was willing to stake his credibility on signals most of the world couldn't see. If Trump blinked, she would know the silence was his to command. Taipei felt the pressure most acutely. Government officials scrambled to reassure the public. President Tsai Ing-wen gave televised speeches promising that Taiwan remained safe, resilient, unbroken. But behind closed doors, she voiced fears. The cyber attacks, the shipping interference, the accidental airspace intrusions, they weren't random. They were deliberate rehearsals, each one probing Taiwan's weak points. She doesn't need a war to win, she told American envoys. He needs time and your hesitation. It was a warning Trump didn't ignore. The Pentagon responded with muscle. U.S. carriers steamed into the Pacific, shadowed closely by Chinese destroyers. Submarines prowled beneath, their positions marked only by the quiet tension in naval briefings. American bombers flew, training runs over Guam, while satellites repositioned to watch every movement in the strait. It was deterrence by presence, a wall of steel and noise against Xi's silence. But Trump understood the risk. The louder America became, the more she could claim China was the victim of aggression. We're walking a tightrope, one intelligence official admitted. Too soft, and she strangles Taiwan. Too loud, and we're the ones who look like we want war. And all the while, Europe watched nervously. NATO allies, still shaken by Russia's satellite strike, struggled to define their role in Asia. Germany and France called for restraint. Britain pressed for solidarity with Washington. Eastern European leaders, haunted by their own fears of Russian pressure, leaned toward Trump's harder line, but the alliance was divided. Was Taiwan truly worth the risk of global war? Or was it better to settle, to sacrifice silence for peace? That divide was exactly the one she hoped to exploit. Markets, as always, were the first to react. Insurance premiums for shipping lanes near Taiwan doubled. Airlines began rerouting flights, adding hours to journeys. Tech companies with factories in Taiwan whispered about contingencies, where to move production if the island grew unstable. Ordinary citizens across the West saw it in subtler ways. Price hikes, stock fluctuations, slower internet connections. The silence of a standoff was bleeding into everyday life, and she counted on that exhaustion. Pressure enough, he believed, would force nations to choose pragmatism over principle. Trump, however, saw the political battlefield clearly. In rallies across America, he framed the Taiwan silence as part of a larger story. First Russia in space, now China and Taiwan, he declared. They test us because they think America is weak. But under me, we're not weak. We're strong. We're strongest. And she knows it. Believe me, he knows it. The crowd roared, but inside the administration, advisors asked the harder question. Strength in words was one thing. Strength in action was another. What action could stop China without setting the world ablaze? In Beijing, Xi Jinping doubled down on the quiet strategy. State media emphasized normal exercises and routine inspections. Foreign diplomats were told that China remained committed to peace, but peace required Taiwan to stop provocations. The message was as old as it was clear. Beijing would define what peace meant, and the world could either accept it or risk chaos. Xi's gamble was that Trump's America, for all its noise, would balk at the cost of pushing back too hard. The standoff wasn't just military, it was psychological. For every Chinese ship, there was a U.S. patrol. For every Taiwanese cyber blackout, there was an American vow of defense. And yet, no side dared to cross the line openly. It was a game of patience, endurance, and perception. She counted on silence lasting long enough to wear down resolve. Trump counted on his noise being loud enough to make silence impossible. And then came the miscalculation. A Taiwanese cargo ship, carrying critical semiconductor components, reported harassment by Chinese Coast Guard vessels. Shots weren't fired, but warning flares lit the night. The ship eventually made port, but the incident triggered alarms across Washington. Trump was briefed within the hour. His response, as always, was immediate. "This is not going to stand," he said. "If she thinks he can choke Taiwan piece by piece, he's got another thing coming." By morning, U.S. destroyers were escorting Taiwanese cargo ships, their guns trained on the horizon. The silence was cracking. She faced his own decision: escalate and risk a direct confrontation with Trump's America, de-escalate and risk looking weak at home. In Beijing's inner circles, analysts whispered that she would never back down publicly. The silent squeeze was meant to be gradual, but Trump's intervention threatened to turn it into a contest of wills. And Xi's will, like Trump's, was iron. NATO, again, found itself caught in the middle. European leaders convened emergency meetings, debating whether to back Trump's escalation or push for negotiations. Some feared the U.S. was dragging them into a conflict not of their making. Others argued that abandoning Taiwan would only embolden China further. The divide grew wider, and Xi's strategy of fracturing the West seemed to bear fruit. But Trump knew the stakes. For him, Taiwan wasn't just about one island. It was about showing the world that silence would not be allowed to strangle freedom. "She wants to do this quietly," he said at a rally in Ohio. "But there's nothing quiet about America. We see it, we call it, and if we have to stop it, we stop it." His words were both a warning and a dare, projected across oceans and into Beijing's halls of power. The silence that began as strategy was now becoming the battleground itself. Could she tighten the rope without triggering war? Could Trump cut the rope without sparking catastrophe? The answer was uncertain, but one truth was already clear. Taiwan was no longer just a flashpoint. It was the place where silence and noise collided, where two leaders with unbending wills tested the limits of power in the 21st century. And as the world held its breath, the silence grew heavier. The standoff reached its breaking point not with a bang, but with a flicker. One night, as Taipei's skyline glittered under neon and storm clouds, a section of the island lost power. Airports froze. ATMs went dark. Cell service dropped for hours. To the public, it looked like a blackout. To intelligence agencies, it looked like a test. Cyber forensics suggested the disruption had originated offshore, routed through layers of camouflage. Officially, China denied everything. Unofficially, no one doubted who had sent the signal. Trump reacted swiftly. From the White House podium, he declared that any further coercion against Taiwan would trigger a direct U.S. response. "She wants silence," he said, his voice echoing across networks. But America answers with clarity. Taiwan will not fall, not quietly, not loudly, not at all. His words turned the blackout from a local crisis into a global flashpoint. She had tried to stay below the threshold of war. Trump had raised the threshold higher, daring Beijing to cross it. Inside NATO, arguments erupted. European diplomats pushed for restraint, urging mediation, treaties, dialogue. Military leaders warned that delay only gave Beijing room to tighten its grip. The question burned in every chamber. If China moved on Taiwan, would the United States drag NATO with it? And if Article 5 meant defending satellites against Russia, did it now mean defending islands against China? The treaties of the last century seemed paper-thin against the crises of this one. Markets trembled. Semiconductor shipments slowed as insurers hesitated to cover routes through the strait. European factories, dependent on Taiwan's chips, stalled. American tech firms issued warnings about shortages. Ordinary citizens felt it in higher prices, longer waits, fewer options. The silent squeeze was no longer confined to military charts. It was spilling into kitchens, offices, and streets around the world. For Xi Jinping, the calculation narrowed. The silent campaign had weakened Taiwan, rattled markets, and divided the West. But Trump's defiance threatened to undo that advantage. Xi could escalate and risk a clash with the most unpredictable American president in generations. Or he could pause and watch the world interpret his silence as retreat. Neither option was clean. Neither option allowed him to keep total control. Trump, however, understood leverage. He ordered the largest joint exercise in the Pacific since the Cold War. U.S. carriers, Japanese destroyers, Australian submarines, all maneuvering in waters Beijing claimed as its own. To the cameras, it looked like deterrence. To Xi, it was a message. America was willing to match silence with spectacle, and spectacle has its own kind of power. Taipei, caught in the middle, braced for impact. President Tsai Ing-wen told her people to stay vigilant, to trust in their resilience, to believe in their democracy. But she also knew that the island's survival depended not only on its courage, but on whether Trump's gamble worked. Taiwan was more than a flashpoint. It was the test case of the century. Whether silence could conquer, or whether defiance could still hold the line. The world waited. Analysts dissected every move, every speech, every shadow on satellite images. Citizens scrolled headlines with unease. Traders watched markets twitch. And above it all, in the gray waters of the strait, the ships remained, silent, immovable, watching each other across the waves. The standoff did not end with victory or surrender. It ended with silence holding, fragile but unbroken. The blackout was restored. The ships stayed at sea. The speeches faded into the noise of politics. But the lesson remained. In this new era, power was no longer measured only in missiles or soldiers. It was measured in silence and signals, in the ability to make the world doubt what tomorrow would bring. Trump had promised clarity. Xi had promised patience. Taiwan had no choice but to endure both. And as the satellites blinked above, as the cities hummed back to life, the question lingered, unresolved. Was this peace, or just a pause before the storm?